Good morning, all. We're still admitting people from the waiting rooms, so we'll give it a few more seconds and begin. And we're also streaming this live on the Rotary Peace Fellow Alumni Association page on Facebook in case you'd like to create a watch party from there.
It's streaming live on Facebook already, so you can start your watch.
Yeah. Right, I think, yeah, most people are in. We still have a few in the waiting room. Welcome, everyone. My name is Rukmini, and I'm the moderator for this session on structural violence. And as we get people in and settle into the session, Jyoti, it's a good time to start the first poll. Let's get a quick check-in in terms of how we are, who we are in this room today. First poll up.
Can everyone
Those
see the
of us
poll?
who are in the room, if you could respond to these two questions that you see. How do you feel and who you are? So we have an idea of the constellation of the room. Right, good to see the responses. Okay, among the audience, we have a mix of Rotarians, peace fellows, peace builders, peace enthusiasts, and others. And I see a lot of excitement and curiosity and peace as we step into the session. That's good to know. For those of us who've just joined in, if you could respond to the poll that you see on the screen. We're just doing a quick check-in in terms of who we are and how we are feeling as we begin this session. And while we do that, I also welcome you to introduce yourself on the chat, as Mark has done to lead us. If you could tell us about who you are, where you're from, and anything else that you'd like to share with the audience here. Right, and maybe we'll give a few more seconds to the poll and then close and begin. All right, I think most of us are in. Jyoti, let's close the poll. Yeah. All right, Jyoti, let's close the poll and let's begin the session. Thank you. Right, good morning, good afternoon, and I suppose also good evening for some of you. My name is Rukmini. I'm a Rotary Peace Fellow and I'm based in Mumbai in India. And a lot of my work is in the space of peace education and dialogue, and I also straddle between this space and the space of corporate leadership development. So those are my areas of work, and I'm the moderator for this session today, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you, and particularly our panelists for today, Chintan Modi and Chintan Mukherjee. And lovely to have a total of 56 participants that we have here right now, along with our audience on Facebook Live. This session is for 90 minutes, and we also hope in the later part of the session to have breakout rooms where we'd love to get your voices in terms of your experiences and insights around structural violence in our world. As we begin, I'd like to open with my comments as a moderator around this particular subject, which has hit us all extremely hard, particularly in the last few months. Not that it did not exist in our world before, it very much did. It's just something that has come to our experience in a very tangible way, given that we are seeing things that we did not quite see before. We are experiencing things that we did not quite experience before. And in that context, I'd like to begin with what I have personally been touched by in the last few months, particularly. I come from India, a country that went into lockdown with a 4-hour notice that began at 8 in the evening, which meant that people practically did not have much time to prepare to step into a lockdown. And there are parts of the country that continue to be in a lockdown. For example, where I live in Mumbai is still a containment zone, which means that I've not stepped out of my house since the 14th of March this year. And as I say that, I know that's also a huge statement of privilege in that I've been able to stay home since the 14th of March and not be worried about starving. And there are millions of people out there who've not had a similar choice in the matter. And here's where structural violence comes in an extremely stark way to our face, in that when we use the term structural violence, for those of us who are in the conflict resolution or peace education space, it's perhaps easier to understand the term. And for the rest of us, it might seem like something that's out there, something that maybe academics talk about or once in a while the media talks about, but it's not something that's in my world. It is usually a perception when it comes to a term like this. And what we'd like to bring in through this panel here today is to understand that structural violence is very real. It operates in all our lives. It operates through us at times. And therefore, if we are to have any hope for peace in the world, it's really important that each of us in our individual capacity start engaging in peace building. We cannot really wait for governments or any other track one processes or international organizations and NGOs to do their work in peace building. It's up to each one of us to be able to tackle structural violence. Let me share with you an image that hit me really starkly in the last few months. And as I share the image and as you see this, I also want to simultaneously read a poem that I had written a few weeks ago. This is an image that was captured by a photographer called Mandeep Singh, who works for a publication called India Today. He did a lot of work trying to document experiences of migrant laborers in India, millions of whom were stranded in the lockdown. And they were stranded literally on the roads with nowhere to live and nowhere to go because there was no transport available for them to go back to their hometowns or home states, as the case may be. And there are extremely disturbing stories around how several of them died, some of starvation, some of other structural violence incidents, and several of them continue to be, and when I say several, I mean several thousands of them continue to be stranded even as we speak. As you look at this picture, I'd like for you to hear my words around this. Look into the little one's eyes and tell him slavery does not exist anymore. Place your hand on your heart and promise him that his freedom will always be honored. Now look into the mirror and tell yourself you told the truth. Do your eyes believe you? Even as the little one's future is sold to his father's masters, who dictate whether or not he deserves the luxury of a home. Look into the little one's eyes and tell him the future is inclusive. Place your hand on your heart and promise him that his choices matter. Now look into the mirror and keep looking, waiting in trust that the little one grows up believing all that you said as he's carried forth by a choiceless father. Do you have the courage to look into the little one's eyes? And with that, I'd like to bring in our panelists for today. And our first speaker is Chintan Modi. Chintan is a prominent writer, writes for several publications in India and abroad. He's done some amazing work on Indo-Pak friendship, and also works a lot in the area of queer rights. And in the next few minutes, he'll be sharing his thoughts and his personal experiences around structural violence and how he thinks we could engage as citizens, as civilians in the peace building process. Over to you, Chintan.
Thank you, Rukmini, for inviting me to this conversation. Hello, everyone who's listening. I have read the poem that Rukmini has shared, and it moves me every time I encounter it again. I think apart from the question of how do you have the courage to look into the little one's eyes, I think the question that we should all be asking is, do I have the courage to look at myself in the mirror? And that is something I would like our conversation to be guided by, at least to some extent. When we talk about structural violence, the lens often is to look outside of ourselves and see and name the various ways in which we are left out or kept out. And we try to overlook or deliberately push away what makes us identify our own complicity in systems that oppress other people. So I hope my sharing now and the discussions that happen later also invite us to think of both. You know, how do we examine our place, and also how the systems impact us in that relationship. I identify as queer. My pronouns are he and they. I see this because some of my sharing around structural violence will be related to this. As some of you might know, the Supreme Court of India read down Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code in 2018. Prior to this, anyone in India who engaged in what was called carnal intercourse against the order of nature could be penalized, punished, harmed even, thanks to police brutality and extra legal mechanisms of torture. But what has now come to be called the decriminalization of homosexuality judgment in India as well as internationally Um, I think that is worth thinking about in terms of the legacy of colonization in not only India, but all countries that have been affected by colonization. I think typically the lens to look is through race, but let us think about how the fight for rights for LGBTQ people around the world, actually no, LGBTQI plus people around the world, is also linked to the legacy of colonization. The criminalization that happened not only in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and various other countries happened because our colonizers decided to criminalize some forms of human experience. Um, as someone who identifies as queer, this judgment has been of significance to me because it has enabled me to write more courageously, openly, and almost fearlessly about my experience and about other experiences. At the same time, I think that it's also important to recognize that queer spaces have their own forms of structural violence, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. Recently, I was working on this article about examining whether queer spaces are accessible to people with disabilities. And that really taught me quite a lot because we might think of ableism as something that exists only in non-marginalized spaces, but ableism is quite alive and present even in queer spaces. So, since Pride marches are the most visible way in which queer and trans rights are spoken of in public discourse, um, who are the queer people that get left out? Do all Pride marches have facilities for, interpreters, wheelchair users? What about people with psychosocial disabilities or mental health issues? If there are queer people experiencing those, do they have equal opportunities to participate in Pride events? These are things that made me question this idea of how often structural violence is looked at only through the specific kind of marginalization that we experience, and our narrative is so built around how we have experienced victimhood that we don't tend to see how others experience it too. So whether it's a trans person who's been denied access to a bathroom, whether it's a Dalit woman who's not been not been allowed to draw water from a well, or it's a disabled person who's been told that they cannot board an aircraft because they're incapable of looking after themselves. These are all instances of structural violence that one sees in everyday life. They are, not these. They're not examples of some extraordinary kind of brutality that is experienced only when there's a monster in the space. These are things that people like us do on an everyday basis. So this is something I would invite you to think about. And the other space that I'm very interested in is of peace education and India-Pakistan dialogue. Um, the Hindu-Muslim conflict that exists in India is very closely linked to the India-Pakistan conflict. We don't have enough time to go into it, but that too is deeply connected to the legacy of colonization. When the British left India in 1947, they left behind two countries, India and Pakistan. Now that has become India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Um, why is it that our countries, even without white rulers, have been unable to resolve the differences that exist between us? It is often easy for us to blame our problems on white people who came and sowed the seeds of, violence amidst us. But when our own people were able to take on the responsibility of, um, governing, ruling, running, why is it that we have fallen back on the same structures of power? Why is it that we're not able to share power? Why is it that we want to dominate each other again? And as we think about structures of power in relation to, race, citizenship, gender, caste, etc., I would also invite you all to think about the structure of consciousness that we enter a space with. So, when I am seeking justice, do I actually want revenge? Uh, when I am seeking a reconciliation, am I able to recognize that the person I am mad at is also a human being with their own set of traumas? Um, that but these kind of questions particularly have become important to me because of my own Buddhist practice, and um, every time that I talk about the structural violence that I've experienced as a brown person in the traveling to the US, or as a queer person living in a queer phobic society like India, I have also been compelled to ask myself what are the ways in which I uh, uh, perpetuate violence. So do I not speak out enough when I see uh, friends and relatives and colleagues of mine making Islamophobic remarks or making casteist remarks? Uh, what are the ways in which I should be stepping up and taking responsibility instead of thinking only about the ways in which I am excluded? So that's something that I'd like to leave you with. Yeah.
Thank you, Chintan. And I wonder if you'd be willing to expand on that last bit, particularly in connection with what you said earlier about the consciousness with which we enter structures. And those structures could be our families, our workplaces, schools, and other institutions. Uh, if I enter a structure with the consciousness or with the identity of being a victim or being on the other side of it, which is being uh, uh, so powerful that I can perhaps perpetrate violence, then that shifts the equation right there. And what might be a tangible way to shift this consciousness as we enter spaces?
When I think of spaces, I just want to say that I think of online as well as offline spaces. And uh, uh, now that now that many of us are working from home, I think it's all the more important to examine online spaces and the structures of violence that we carry into these. How do I respond to disagreement on social media? That for me is a very important piece of this conversation. Um, am I abusive to people who don't agree with me, or am I able to say, I hear you, but I have a different point of view, and that comes from my lived experience? Um, that can be difficult to do because one feels so triggered, and it is so easy to lash out at someone who is uh, just another blip of a presence on social media, someone you don't have a real human connection with. But as we know, we are going to interact more and more with people from around the world online. I think it's useful to think not only in terms of digital etiquette, but also um, how can I here honor the humanity of people who I am in dialogue with? Is it possible for me to pause? This is something that I have found important to do. especially when the issue that is being discussed relates to my own identity. So, for example, recently J.K. Rowling put out a set of tweets that are that have been labeled transphobic and TERFy. TERF stands for trans exclusionary radical feminism. And instead of apologizing for the harm that she caused, this author went on to write a long essay that did further harm to the lived experience of trans people. She was able to do that as a rich white cis woman, an author of great privilege who's read internationally in various kinds of translations. Of course, I, like many other people, were really annoyed with Rowling for doing something like this during Pride Month. But how do I participate in that conversation? Do I go to Rowling's Twitter handle and shout at her? Do I call her names? Is that going to make things better for trans people in my country and anywhere else? I found these questions important to ask because sometimes social media seems like a weapon that is very easy to use and one that requires pretty little accountability, and everyone feels uh, happy because they can bond over someone they want to collectively attack. But I have been thinking about whether attack as a form of protest worsens the situation, or if it makes people who were not hearing earlier sit up and take notice. This is not to undermine any trans activists or allies who have written to Rowling in harsh terms. I know that tone policing is very much a reality, and often people who are hurt in a situation are asked to tone down the criticism so that it can be palatable to people in power. That's not my intention. My intention is, as someone from the community, to think about how do we participate in public education in meaningful and responsible ways that will make things better for people who come after us. Because I may feel really good right now by lashing out at someone. Does it make things better for people outside the space I'm in? Or am I only appropriating their cause for myself to pat myself on the back? Um, I think this is what I meant when I said structures of consciousness that Rukmini asked me to expand on. So yeah, I don't want to take up more time on this panel. I'm excited to hear what other people have to say.
That was valuable, Chintan. Thank you. It makes the idea of our role as individuals in peace building really clear. So thanks for naming that. And for those of us who joined in a while ago, welcome. My name is Rukmini and I'm moderating this panel. And who you just heard was Chintan Modi. And if you have, if any of us have questions that you'd like for the panelists to address, please put those up on the chat box and we'll attempt to weave that into our conversation. Next up, we have Jayanto Mukherjee. Jayanto is currently an external affairs director at a leading university in India. He comes from a really eclectic background in terms of working in a think tank specializing in South Asian geopolitics and security. He's again done a lot of work around the Indo-Pak context and violence in that space. He's also done a lot of work around the role of media and education related to media. So Joy, welcome, and we look forward to hear what you have to say.
Thank you for that, Rukmani, and thank you for inviting me to this lovely session. And it's early in the morning here in Bombay, in India. So good morning to everyone. And it's great to hear the views which are being shared. And I thought I'll just set up a little different pattern to the discussion which we're having, because what I really feel is in order to understand the problem, of structural violence, we have to see that how is it being also propagated to us through various channels. And what do we see regularly across? How are we victims to certain amount of stereotyping and propaganda? And how do places across the world are looking at these problems in almost the same through the same lens? Because what I've seen is that when there are racism issues in the West, there are casteism issues here in the subcontinent. It all connects down to the color, it connects down to the thinking. And if you take a step back, media plays a very big role in actually embedding these differences in a very subtle, yet in a very direct way. Um, just an open, small question to everyone who's listening in, and y'all can type it in the chat. What's the common thing between Thanos, the villain of the MCU, Scar, the villain in Lion King, and Jafar, the villain in Aladdin? What's that one common thing which you feel you have? And I'll give you a clue, you've seen them. And you can type it down in the chat. Lust for power is coming in, fair enough. Involvement, power, control. These are a lot of main characteristics which are coming out as villains. But if you see, how does the media stereotype it? They're all dark colored skin. The skin tones are very distinct. If you see Jafar, because he's an Arab villain, so he'll be dark. Whereas the protagonists in Aladdin, Jasmine and Prince Ali, are sort of tanned Westerners rather than actually Arab looking. Same goes for Lion King. Scar's mane, the lion's mane, is dark in color, but Simba and Mustafa have it light in color. Thanos has a distinct dark color space, and very similar to the DC's Thanos, which is known as Darkseid, named Darkseid also. So if you see, there is a big pattern when it comes to also showing good versus evil. And that's probably where the first propagation of this happens into our society. And I'm not saying this is a Western culture. Even here in India, when we read children's comics, so there is a character known as Chota Bheem, which is probably the most famous Indian animated series going on today, and 40 million viewers it has. It has a big influence on children. My child himself is a big fan of it. But my basic problem there is when Chota Bheem goes and fights people, the villains or the people who are causing trouble, very easily they're shown in dark skin. And this is something which I feel is where I have firstly encountered structural violence, where it's being kept in my mind that anything which is dark skin will have an evil connotation to it, will have a negative connotation. And that gives a lot of base to what's happening across. Again, as a subcontinent, there is this whole myth in our mind that when an Indian boy has to get married, the bride has to be fair-skinned in color. And matrimonial ads in India are famous for this. We have had case studies on this regularly, where the first line of the matrimonial ad is looking for a suitable bride, looking for a suitable groom for a fair-skinned girl, or looking for a fair-skinned bride for a suitable groom. It's always there in the face. And that's is where all these things are starting. Because we have to understand that we are in the middle of the highest amount of propaganda, stereotyping, influence which is there because social media is there on a palm tops on a regular basis. Our kids, youngsters across are reading comics, are watching movies, are getting influenced by such propaganda 24/7. If India, we feel, is just having a problem of Hindu Muslims, India has a problem in Hindus itself having so many sectors and sections in between. Muslims in Pakistan have so many sections in between. And every sect thinks that they are the larger one and hence they can dominate the minority in it. In India, when Bollywood influences everyone around, why is it that the top 10 hero names, screen names of the Bollywood stars are Hindu in nature? You have the biggest star in Indian cinema, which you all would have heard, Amitabh Bachchan, and his name resonates as a star across the world. He's used his screen name Vijay 21 times till now. Vijay means victory. Subtle influencing through your own naming structure also. Shah Rukh Khan, the second person, this and obviously a very popular name across the second biggest star from our space, uses the name Rahul more than 15 times in his movies. This is where I feel a lot of stereotyping happens, and that's where we are open victims of structural violence. Because we have been told by the media around, we have been told by the higher powers around that there is certain belongingness in certain skin colors, names, caste, communities, and the others don't. And that's where I think so we start with the problem. First, we need to identify that is so common around. And that's the reason I am not even discussing the Black Lives Matters movement in the West, because in our space we have been fighting this conflict on a daily basis. Like it was such a big event 2-3 days ago when a very prominent cosmetic company came out and said that we will change the way we have been selling skincare in India, because they were running a campaign which was known for so many years, decades, on the concept of fair and lovely. And fair and lovely meaning absolutely gorgeous, clean, light colored skin. And they would use that regularly across. They would use that in their ads where they would show a dark skin tone girl being asked to use fair and lovely, and suddenly after 3-4 days she's looking brighter and lighter colored in nature. And this company recently came out and said, we have understood the issues we have done, and we will now change the way this is seen, and we will ensure that we address to everyone equally. My problem is you're telling this to me in 2020. We have been, my mother was looking at those ads when she was young. And now it's 2020 when we feel that things have actually progressed. And then one of the biggest companies comes out and accepts it. So this is where I feel a lot of things are being imbibed into us. We can speak about the differences when it comes to caste in India, the differences when it comes to color in the West, the differences when it comes even in the religion. But I think so that is something which is we know. I don't want to discuss about that part of it. What I really want to use this platform to say is that how do we get involved in this in such at a very subconscious space? The messaging is so clear to us, and we have accepted it. It was, I think so, a few years ago, it was a big thing when Spider-Man, Miles Morales became Spider-Man in the West, and Spider-Man was seen as someone who can be dark colored also, and he can be one of the prominent heroes. Why did it take so much of time for that event to happen? Why did it take so much of time for Fair and Lovely in India to come out and say that dark colored is something which we have to accept? Why does it take, why hasn't the Indian parent still stood up and said the marriage between two lives is more important than the two skins? Stereotyping in India is absolutely appalling. Where we know that if it's a South Indian, they have to be dark colored in nature. India is divided into North and South, and they have their own. We have our own problems with everyone. We conflict with them even in the way they speak, how they speak the language. We regularly stereotype them when they speak Hindi, and that happens in movies, that happens in theater, in cinema. It happens everywhere, and that is the messaging which comes to us. And the same happens in Pakistan. If you see in Pakistan, it's just not about the Sunni and Shia divide. Where do the Ahmadiyas go? Where do the people who are following Sufism go? They have been targeted on a regular basis. In fact, the Pakistani constitution in the 1970s went out and said that Ahmadiyas will actually be known as non-Muslims because they don't follow Prophet Muhammad as their ultimate God. They see it as their best God. And there are more than 2 million Ahmadiyas in Pakistan. They almost constitute 1% of the population right now. So everywhere there is a structural violence issue which is glaring in the face, which is not just as simple as a difference between two colors or two mindsets. And when we are still discussing this in 2020, that is where my problem begins with. If we were discussing this in the 90s, I could have understood it's a relevant issue. If we were discussing this probably in the early 2000s, it was irrelevant. If 2020, we're discussing it at a serious way. We're not discussing this just as a case study of the past. We're discussing this that, okay, we have still not fought with this properly. We have still not addressed this properly. We are still being given capsules where all the differences are held mentally between all these sections, and somewhere we accept it. That means we have not even seen the main issue, and the elephant in the room just remains there itself. And if I again go back to Pakistan, because why am I speaking more about India, Pakistan, probably Pakistan a little more, because I think so it's also important to understand every country has its structural violence issue in a very different way, but it's still there. It doesn't mean that because it's a Muslim country, so they will have probably not the same violence, they're not the same issue, and probably they're not still addressing it in the same way. Their plays in the 80s and the 90s have addressed these issues regularly. But where did the effect go? Nowhere. In our country, my cinema is still looking for its most prominent Muslim screen hero. I have Muslim heroes who are prominent. The Shah Rukh Khans of the world, the Salman Khans of the world, the Saif Ali Khans of the world. But they're forced to take up Hindu names in the movies. So I still don't have a prominent Muslim hero which I can look up to. I don't have my Miles Morales in India today. I don't. I still, even when we read, and Rukmani and Chintan actually can correlate to this, the most famous comics in our times in the 90s was something known as Tinkle comics. And they were a revolution because they would teach good versus bad in a very subtle, good comic way. And we were fans. All of us were fans. They had one-pagers. They had very, very good messages in it. Later on, probably when I was in college, I came to know that it was one of the biggest capsule of stereotyping ever. I didn't realize it during my student time, my schooling time. But I think so. We were one of the very few to realize it, that what we were being fed. We were being fed on a regular basis that good versus evil means light color versus dark color. All the people who would be antagonists in those comics would be very directly having dark brown and dark colored skins, and also having names which were directly connected. So they would have a name known as Kalia in it. Kalia is in Hindi, so it's like it's a name for black. So there was a direct push on it. Anyone who had a negative character would have probably those dark colored mustaches. Even these things are so subtle, but today it makes so sense that we were being fed in such a negative way. That means the good will never have a mustache, and the bad will have those dark, bushy mustaches. They'll have a mole on their right side. They'll have those dark hair, long hair. All of this was messaging in a country like ours, without even saying that there was a Hindu Muslim. In the Hindu itself, there were so many spaces of difference. And when we are fed this, and then when we grow into employable age, and then when we go into the work structures, and there was a time when Indians didn't want to maintain beard stylings while working, because they would be stereotyped into, okay, well, you're keeping a beard, suddenly are you a Muslim? And this is an office rant. This is an office rant in progressive corporates in India. Even today, unfortunately, when we are in a lockdown situation, when right now it's opened up a little bit in India, but when we were in the peak of lockdown and we would be working from home, and we would not be motivated to have daily shaves, and we would be actually growing up a beard, subtle office jibes from your bosses would come in a Zoom call. You're looking like Osama. Wow. And this is where it exists. And it's so, and I'm speaking from the Indian perspective. Why am I saying it? Because think that even at our end, the thinking is on these lines. We don't need to even discuss what's happening in the West as Asians, because we are probably bigger proponents of these differences. And it exists everywhere. There are numerous occasions where a lot of apartments in the prominent cities of India don't allow Muslim owners to come in and stay, even as tenants, that not even to buy, even as tenants. You have places where the building, the apartment is only meant to be occupied by a certain religion. And that religion is pure vegetarian in nature also. So there is a problem in even eating non-veg, even eating meat. So that's where I'm saying that think of the different layers which we have across. And I come back to that point, 2020, we are still talking about so-called beacon of the world. We are known as, we're supposed to be the people who are wiser than a lot of things. We are known as intellectual people across. But what's the use of having that tag when we still don't know how to treat the people in our country? And to give you a acceptance mindset of my country, when farmers commit suicide in our country, there is no upheaval on Facebook. It's accepted as a norm because they belong to a certain strata of society which doesn't conflict with us or doesn't matter to us. But when a celebrity commits suicide, we go hammer and tongs on social media, and we keep on telling everyone, this is sad. You should look at us when there is depression. If you're sad, speak to me. Being in depression, don't look at these thoughts. I have nothing against a certain strata of society being vocal about depression. But what I've certainly against is we have accepted the fact that when a poor man commits suicide, it's okay. And the lockdown has shown us the biggest reflection of our reality. So the photo which Rukmani started with and the poem you followed, that's the biggest reflection of my country today. Of my country, which is edging towards 75 years of independence of my country, which is very proud when an Indian becomes the CEO of Google, of Microsoft, and we are absolutely banging our chest because that's an Indian there. But when the same Indian dies, scores of Indians die because of poverty, because of issues around them. We don't even blink an eyelid. And I'm literally saying we don't blink an eyelid. And that's how serious the problem is. And think of this. Chintan was very clear in speaking about the issues which are with the LGBTQ community across. The reason I took a macro level is in India, think of this that where for us still the LGBTQ issue is not an issue. Even after passing certain laws which were earlier against it, now for it, we are not even discussing them in schools and colleges. Forget anything else. And that's how deep-rooted a structural violence issue is there in the subcontinent across all the countries. If I speak about, there is a stat which is one of the worst stats I've ever read, and unfortunately it's a real stat. And an average of 7 people, 5 to 7 people are killed in Karachi on a daily basis as part of target killing. Target killing in Karachi is one of the biggest problems, and there are several articles written on the internet regarding this. The newspapers follow it, and we used to follow it when I was working in think tank, just to understand that why would target killing be such an issue. But where did target killing become an issue? Where we came to know the people who were killed were intellectuals, were journalists, professors, teachers, doctors, because they were seen as people who would somewhere challenge religious extremism in that country. But later on, when people started finding, okay, what other things are there, they would normally not turn out to be Sunnis. They would be either Shias or Ahmadiyas or the other minorities. So there's a combination of two thoughts there. It's just not about being a journalist who can write well, but you're a journalist from a minority, hence I know what you will write, hence I will kill you. And the target killings were done by mainly under the orders of certain prominent political parties, not even just as part of probably terrorism. So in the subcontinent, structural violence exists in a very, very direct, in the face way. And please understand this, when the Black Lives Matters movement is happening in the West today, at least you'll have the right to turn up and protest for it, to ask for it. Ask Rukmini, ask Chintan, ask myself, ask any Indian, when was the last time we allowed Muslims to even stand up in India and protest for their own rights? When Dalits stand up, we see them as minorities who are like, okay, they have their, but they have it well because they already have reservations. That's what a rich Indian Hindu would say. They have reservations, they'll get their jobs. It's okay. No one addresses to the fact that why did we actually give them reservations? No one addresses that fact. People question reservations in India as if it's something which is more of a political gimmick. Yes, it is a political gimmick, absolutely. But have we addressed to the fact that who are the people who are getting reservation? Have they been actually lifted up from the space? No. No one wants to address that elephant in the room. And when the minorities protest in India, we keep on telling them that, see, we are giving you so much of right to even protest, as if it's a given. If it's something which I'm actually allowing you to do. So one, we don't have that much of vocal protest, and when the vocal protest is there, it's shown as if I've given you the permission to do it. Hence, be happy for this. So when the whole protest in India happened and there was a space known as Shaheen Bagh, which became the biggest scene in India during the in the last 3-4 months because of a certain law which was being passed regarding the rights of staying in the country and being known as Indian in the country, and the large number of minorities stood up. It divided a country in such a way that see, they are not patriotic, see, they were not Indians, hence they are protesting. Think of the mindsets we keep on bringing in this country. So forget till the time I'll come towards the progression, what the US and the Europe of the world are seeing. And it all comes down to the place of schooling and education where I feel the biggest change makers should be. And that's something which I think all of us should discuss. How can education be the biggest? I feel education will be the biggest, will need to play the biggest role in this. But for that, we'll have to redefine education itself. Because education in today's frame will not solve this problem. Because education in today's frame has actually accepted the stereotyping, and that is what is showing us the differences today. We need to change the system itself for the system to work sometimes. And being an academician, I'm telling you this. Those were my 2 cents on this.
Thank you, Joy. And I know that you've stirred up a lot of questions, and questions for which there are no easy answers. And yet the call of the times is really for us all to have the courage to stay with questions and not really jump into answers. And and I'm also glad, and I want to acknowledge the reflections and responses on the chat that are coming in terms of acknowledgement of how we experience structural violence in different parts of the world. So thank you for that, and do continue that reflection. We will step into a breakout room discussion now. We will spend time with smaller groups working with for questions, which Jyoti, if you could paste that for us in the chat box. And it's possible that the time could be short to discuss all the 4 questions in depth, but one question that I definitely want us to come back with responses to is the last one, which is around what's the action that you commit to in your individual capacity to promote equity, to mitigate structural violence. So that's definitely something that I'd like for us to respond to. And I would encourage you to also work with the other questions as well. Each breakout room will have facilitators who will hold space as you discuss the responses. And one person from each group can be a reporter when we come back to the main room, and you can perhaps in a few seconds share the gist of the discussion in your group as well. So let's step into the breakout rooms. You will see a join link on your screen, and please do click on it to step into your breakout rooms.
Hello. Oopsie.
It takes a few minutes to move everyone.